this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. So cool to have Bret Weinstein back on the show. We had an awesome conversation last time. He's incredibly intelligent, very well spoken, and really fun to talk to. And I think everybody really liked the last one. And we never got to the evolutionary theory, the biologist background that Bret has. So I'm glad we could do that today. Dr. Weinstein, thank you so much for being on the show.
I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
So we'll mostly leave the politics out of it. But what I didn't even get to ask you last time is you live in Portland. How is that going for you and your wife right now? What is it like for those of us who really just see the news and Antifa? What I'm more because I kind of know the answer, right? There's a section that's in complete disarray, and then the rest of the city is maybe normal, right? Any reasonable person could probably know that, but what do people think about it all? That's actually the question that I have. Like, what do your neighbors think about everything?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say even if you're able to correct for the distortion that the media gives us, you still probably don't have a good idea of what's going on in Portland, because on the one hand, although it's not quite as localized as it was a couple of weeks back, since the federal presence has been greatly reduced, the riots have moved on to other things. They're still happening, but they're not quite as predictable in terms of where they're going to be. But they are very limited in scope. You can travel around Portland and you see almost no evidence of the riots unless you're downtown, where there is still quite a bit of damage visible. What you do see is an awful lot of signage indicating what I would argue is fealty to this movement. And in some ways, I find it very frightening, because it is not clear that this is an organic misunderstanding. I think people correctly reason that there is a threat to voicing any sort of skepticism about the claims of the movement or its objectives. And so while it is certainly the case that most of Portland is as beautiful as ever, and we are enjoying a lovely summer. Our summers are as nice as anywhere on earth, I'm convinced of that. But there is a kind of reason to be nervous in the air, especially in light of the fact that the civilian authorities that have control over our police have shown every indication of misunderstanding the importance of preserving the rule of law.
Yeah. And I guess my question is still, like, what do your neighbors think about this? I mean, do people have opinions that would maybe match your opinion and my opinion, and they're afraid to speak their minds, or are they with the protesters? And when this signage goes up, is it sort of a virtue signaling to indicate that, hey, we're with you, please don't burn down my store? What do people really think?
Well, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, and some of it is even explicit about, we support BLM, don't damage our store. So some of it is that direct. And the rest of it looks rather generic. Black Lives Matter signs are everywhere. In terms of what people actually think, it's actually a more complicated question than you would imagine, because I think very frequently people sign on based on either the fact that they only look at the label, and as I think we discussed last time, Black Lives Matter is a label I can fully get behind. What I don't get behind is the contents of the box that is bearing that label. If you look at what Black Lives Matter, the organization, stands for example, it is against things as important as the nuclear family, for example. So in any case, people who aren't looking very deeply into the meaning and think it is simply about Black liberation or protection from police brutality sign on the basis of that alone. And then others sign on the basis of a credible threat to their livelihood that they perceive from the rioting and some of the things that the movement says. So it's very hard to detect whether somebody earnestly subscribes to this, because if they subscribe at first out of fear, they will then quickly rationalize that they are in fact enthusiastic when the evidence suggests otherwise. There's still the freedom to privately speak your doubts, and many of my neighbors have doubts, but there's also, I think, far too much trust that the foolishness that flies under the label of Black Lives Matter will sort itself out, and that ultimately nothing serious will happen, when in fact, even Seattle is currently playing with the tools to dismantle its police department, which will, of course, create a crime wave that's utterly predictable. So the fact that that the movement has this kind of power over civilian authorities should give us all pause.
So, does this relate at all to your thoughts on what you call the fourth frontier? You have a really interesting. Is it a lecture? That you have an interesting set of ideas on what you call the fourth frontier, discovering humanity's future, and it's based on this idea that abundance, which we are in now, this sort of this growth that we've had as a human race for so long, is sort of plateaued now. We have an excess of abundance, which creates this kind of tyranny and this instability and this identity politics. Is that related to? So now I'm getting into your evolutionary theorist expertise, and because I think it's a really cool place to go with you. Is that related at all to what we're seeing?
Very definitely. So if I can just lay it out, the basic point is that all creatures, humans included, are in search of a growth opportunity. So we all know from whatever basic evolution we took in high school or college that that creatures are looking to increase their fitness. If you discover an opportunity that makes you much more capable of producing offspring, that's evolutionarily good. And so you can have a geographic frontier that you discover that there's a valley adjacent to yours that is hospitable to life, and your population could go up because you discover that valley and start exploiting it. That's the first kind of frontier. The second kind of frontier is a technological frontier where you discover that you can make more of whatever geographic opportunity you have. So, for example, moving from hunting and gathering to farming increases how many humans you can have on a given piece of land. And then the third frontier is when those two initial frontiers run out, human beings actually innovate a mechanism to keep something that feels like growth going. And it frequently involves stealing from populations that can't defend what they have. And so warfare and genocide are both mechanisms by which populations reestablish something that feels like growth for their population. And most of the worst atrocities in history have something to do with this third frontier process. And so my argument is that what we have to do, since there are no more geographic frontiers and the technological frontiers are not infinite, we cannot rely on them to simply produce growth anytime we need it, that what we have to do is engineer a steady state, a kind of equilibrium that delivers people the same sensation that they have when they have achieved the discovery of some growth opportunity, but without us stealing it from our friends and neighbors.
And that seems to make sense. So when I hear that, I don't know if we're agreeing on this, but when I hear that, I'm thinking, well, the free market sort of lets you do that. You can pursue your happiness in your own way. You can create that business. It gives you some sense of purpose, some sense of dignity, and you're operating within the system. It's not necessarily a new frontier, but it's working for you. Does that fit the bill?
Well, I'm worried about the word free because, as you may remember, I'm a huge fan of markets. I believe that markets are capable of doing certain things better than any other mechanism does or probably can. So I want to see markets preserved, but market failure is a serious problem. And so I do think in order to get to a fourth frontier state, you have to figure out how to protect the market so that people have access to it and they can deliver themselves basically personal growth for their families. What you can't have is a system in which economic ebb and flow causes expansion and contraction, because as those contractions come, we will go after each other, which is, I believe, what we are currently seeing. And that was your initial question.
Yeah.
So what I want to see is us grow up a little bit with respect to markets and figure out two things. One, what are the jobs that markets don't do very well, and how can we isolate those processes from market forces? And to the extent that other processes are best done in the context of a market, how can we preserve the opportunity so it is as broadly distributed as possible, so that people do have an opportunity to generate growth for their families, and that applies to everybody, so that it's the best game in town, and people will do it. People will be looking for what it is they can do that generates wealth for all of us and therefore enriches them. That's a perfectly honorable motive, and it needs to reach everyone.
Yeah, I don't think that's a controversial statement by any means. It's sort of, it gets at equality of opportunity. Now, I don't think opportunity can always be exactly equal, but it does get to this notion that we want everybody to be able to succeed along these lines. If they're making the right decisions, they deserve to succeed. That seems, and that would explain to some extent what's happening here. I mean, I think it's when you look at some of these protests, it seems to be a mix of of both actual problems being fought against, but also a sort of a storytelling and a narrative that isn't necessarily based in truth, but is believed nonetheless, and amps up the conversation to an extraordinary degree that results in these, burning down of places, because it seems very disproportionate to the actual problems being exposed.
Or at least to their nature. The fact is, imagining that the unfairness that is real is the result of racism, which is actually fairly rare, is just simply a disaster unfolding. Because the misdiagnosis of it is going to mean that the cure is going to be completely incapable of addressing it.
Yeah.
So that mismatch is a serious problem, even if people are correctly understanding that there's something wrong with the system. Now, we could argue about whether they have the magnitude right, but even if they've got the magnitude right, the misdiagnosis is a huge hazard.
Oh, it's huge. But yeah, because it leads you down a path of solutions that has nothing to do with the original problem and makes us hate each other even worse. It's a problem. So in the fourth frontier, you talk about engineered stable abundance, and so to fight these sort of existential threats that we might face. And so, what do those look like? I mean, do you get into those, or because you also talk about more of a striving for common values as opposed to necessarily policy solutions. So, what do you mean by engineered stable abundance?
Well, a couple things. One, you need policy that creates opportunity on long time scales rather than policy that generates short time scale opportunity that costs us in the long run. That's a trick we have to learn. But I also suspect that many of the longest lived and most successful cultures that have existed on the earth have actually discovered a path, if not to permanent steady state, to at least very long lasting steady states. And I am imagining that when we ultimately understand the nature of, for example, the pyramid building cultures, we will discover that what they found was a means for buffering against the ebb and flow that would otherwise accompany, even just climatic cycles. So if you produce crops, for example, and it's responsive to exactly how much food you can produce this year, you produce the maximum amount, then a good year will produce an increase in population. And when you have a not such good year, that will automatically generate starvation. So one thing you want to do is install some kind of buffer so that when you have a good year, it isn't converted into more mouths, it's converted into something else of value. So I think what we will find if we look, for example, at the ancient Maya, they built these immense structures, but these structures are not they're not what they appear to be. They're not just buildings that were blueprinted and then erected. They're actually structures that grew over hundreds of years in many cases. And so the ability to invest in these projects that serve the community in good times so that lean times don't involve people facing severe austerity, that's almost certain to be the key.
Yeah, and does this? Would you argue that this can happen? I guess by design. I mean, can a single generation really implement these buffers, or does it almost by necessity have to happen over time and in some kind of evolutionary process?
I think we can start, and that, like everything else, we're going to end up with a prototype, and we're going to discover what it is we didn't know, and then we can improve it. But that's not a hard process as long as you know what your objective is.
Yeah.
So if we can agree, for example, that life is a very precious thing, and that freedom makes it marvelous, and that we wish to deliver as much free life to as many people as we can, then it is also important that the system that does that lasts as long as it can in order to provide that opportunity to an indefinitely large number of generations. And so in some sense, that's our responsibility. It is our responsibility to preserve the nation, for example, so that it can house an indefinitely large number of future generations of Americans who can enjoy the freedom that we have.
Yeah, like you said, it has to start at a certain point. I'm certainly I'm critical of those who might say that they've got all the ideas right here, right now. If you just give the experts enough power and authority to implement the perfect system, then it'll work. And this kind of gets into utopianism. You talk about utopianism a little bit. So what are the two things that utopians get wrong?
Well, first of all, they imagine that they know enough to make their system. And the other thing that they invariably do wrong is they try to maximize something, one parameter. And the problem is that because trade-offs are the relationship between desirable parameters, if you maximize one, you crash every other. And so, an individual who is focused, for example, on justice, they may correctly understand that justice is a very positive thing. But what they don't understand is if you turn the justice slider to 100%, then you lose all of your freedom. And so it is very important not to listen to folks who are very focused on one thing and are downplaying what it is connected to. And it is equally important to discount the view of anybody who thinks they do understand the blueprint of a complex future system from here. The best you can do is a series of prototypes that get you closer and closer to an objective, or the other analogy I like is navigation. We are navigating to some endpoint that we have reason to believe exists. But people who think they know more about how to get there than they could possibly know are a huge danger, which is why I've called utopianism the worst idea humans ever had.
Yeah. Well, what does it mean again? It means simultaneously, I think, perfection and also nowhere. I mean, it's by definition, it's unachievable, and we could ruin ourselves trying to achieve it.
Yes, yeah,
you talk about the law of diminishing returns being one reason for that. Can you explain that?
Sure. Any complex system in which you have an objective. So the weather is complex, but there's no objective to the weather. But in other complex systems, like an economy, you have an objective. And the problem is the pursuit of any individual constituent will automatically, as a law of nature, experience diminishing returns, which means that you'll get spectacular returns on your early investments. And then as you get farther and farther into pursuing more of that good, you'll pay a larger and larger amount for smaller and smaller gains. So you can be very free. You might be able to be 85% of completely free. But if you pursue 100% freedom, then it will come at the cost of things you won't find acceptable. So the good news is if you imagine that diminishing returns rules all of the values that we would pursue, then we can have most of all of them, but we can't have all of any of them, and we certainly can't have all of them. So if you can get people to accept that you can be very free, you can be very safe, but you can't be both totally free and totally safe, then you can begin to talk about, well, what end state are we looking for? And as soon as people become realistic about that, there is a very wide canvas on which we could paint a future system. But if people are going to be childish and pursue any individual value all the way to the end point, they're going to ruin it for everyone.
Right. There's trade-offs in life. And, I'm of the opinion that we haven't had a great conversation, nationally speaking, about trade-offs recently. Really, the entire human race, as it relates to COVID. I don't know that we've had honest conversations about that, about the conflict between safety and freedom. I just think it's really interesting how you lay this stuff out in the fourth frontier. It's an interesting way to think about that. I like frameworks like that. They help us think better, and thinking better would probably be a good goal to have for America right now.
It's a great goal, but the thing is, people understand this stuff in their personal lives, right? Everybody, if you ask somebody, how safe do you want your car to be, right? Well, the answer is, you've only asked me about safety. I want it to be completely safe. But then if I say, well, we can do that. We can give you a tank, and it'll burn 5 gallons of fuel per mile, and it won't go very fast, and you won't be able to park it easily, and all of those things. Then people say, well, I guess I would accept a small cost in safety in order to make it a practical vehicle. And so, you fill this picture out, and sooner or later people end up with the kind of cars that they actually buy, in which they pay a substantial but not huge cost. We have very safe cars. They've gotten better. I mean, airbags were a massive increase in safety, as were seat belts before them. But you're not going to have perfection, and it doesn't stop you from getting on the highway.
Right. And that, for some reason, that doesn't apply to broader policy making. And one of the reasons for that is politicians are very quick to promise you that there are no trade-offs. We can't fall for it anymore.
Amen.
That's one of the things that worries me. The reason I'm a conservative is like, I don't think we do that. We have sort of limiting principles to say, well, we can't spend that much. Okay, we can't make the government do all of that. It won't work. Again, for a variety of reasons. Maybe one of them is diminishing returns. You can only layer so many programs atop of one another. And if you're not seeing the result you want, it doesn't necessarily mean double up on the bad idea. But to get elected, the incentive is to promise that you can have your cake and eat it too. Even though, like you said, we really don't live our lives like that at all. It's a toxic political culture that we have to collectively rebel against. But I see no signs of that happening anytime soon.
I don't see signs of it in the political landscape so much, but I do see signs of it elsewhere. And it leaves me hopeful that we could actually break this dynamic. So in my teaching life, when I was teaching college, one of my policies was to be brutally honest with my students about what I actually thought was going on in the world, how I thought it related to subject matter that we were studying. And it wasn't always a happy picture, but students were so grateful. They live in a world of garbage and bond to somebody tell them what attitude. So I think part of the problem is that we are not given good choices to which we might gravitate. And if we were given those choices, I think a lot more people might be interested in hearing the truth than we might suspect based on what they vote for presently.
So I I share your optimism. I will willfully share your optimism on that. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think it's important to give more information, not less. I think people inherently distrust talking points from politicians just because, I was a voter not too long ago and not overly involved in politics. And so talking points made me distrustful because it feels like you're trying to sneak one by me. And so, people can hear more information, and it's important that we give it to them. Okay, I want to change subjects completely because this is just on my mind, and you're an evolutionary biologist, and so I want to ask you about aliens. And it's hard to ask this question without laughing, but it's so crazy to me that in 2020 we have pretty distinct evidence of UFOs, of otherworldly objects, as the Pentagon themselves will describe this. It didn't really register on the minds of the public, maybe because there's a few other things going on. But again, from your scientific perspective, what are the chances? Do you think about this very often? What are the chances that there's truly complex, intelligent life outside of Earth?
Well, let's put it this way. If my understanding of how human beings ended up on this planet is accurate, then the chances that there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is a near certainty. However, that's a long way from saying that it is a certainty that we will ever be in contact. The chances are very hard to calculate for a number of reasons. One, we just don't have enough data on what other planets are like and how hospitable they are to life, because we don't even know what the limits of life would look like. We only know the examples that we have available, which are all connected together. The other thing is, if there was intelligent life nearby enough that we could be visited, they might be likely to come out of just curiosity or some other purpose to engage us. And so that would drive the chances of our actually having an encounter up from what they would be just randomly waiting to interact. I'm not convinced. I haven't looked carefully at what the Pentagon acknowledges, but I do think something interesting is afoot. Now, whether that something interesting is a psychological operation designed to persuade us that something has been encountered, it kind of doesn't look that way to me, but of course it wouldn't. So, I think all possibilities are open. I'm not sure exactly why this is an American story rather than a global story. It seems to me that aliens would be, to the extent they were interested in visiting and being known to be here, they wouldn't have a particular interest in one nation or another, or they might be interested in talking to us because they could detect that we were the most powerful nation on Earth, but we certainly wouldn't be the only people on the list. So I'd be curious. I am curious how this story will play out, but I don't rule anything out. It's certainly likely that such creatures exist and possible that we would encounter them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an open-ended way to look at it. I'm gonna try and pin you down. So have you seen the footage that the U.S. Navy recorded? So there was some flights off the coast of San Diego. I think Joe Rogan's podcast probably gives the best story of it because he had the actual pilot on his podcast and they went into detail on this. I mean, it's fascinating the way this craft moves and they analyze every aspect of it. They can see it on radar. They can, they're looking at it. There's multiple pilots with eyes on this thing. The way it moves is impossible by our standards. There's no rotor wash. It's just incredible. It happened off the East Coast as well, slightly different looking craft. Of course, it's not just an American phenomenon. I think our pop culture has certainly been raptured by it, maybe more than most other cultures. But of course, you can go on the internet and find sightings of anywhere.
Sure.
I mean, the whole thing is it's fascinating. But this is the first time that we've got pretty hard to refute evidence that there is something there. Now, where it comes from is still, of course, in question. But it's worth looking into, to say the least.
I do have a perspective on its meaning that may be what you're hunting for, which is if we are being visited, this is potentially extremely good news, and it is arriving not a moment too soon. Because if there are visitors, they might have a very good idea about where we are. And I don't know how familiar your listeners will be with the Fermi paradox, but the Fermi paradox is basically a recognition that the universe is awfully quiet with respect to intelligent creatures communicating in a way that could be detected. And the usual interpretation is that the technology that would allow you to be detected at a great distance comes along with the technology that would allow you to destroy yourself as a species. And so species that have that technology tend not to last very long, leaving the universe quiet. And so were we being visited, it would clearly be by a technologically advanced civilization that had somehow escaped that problem. And they might be in a position to tell us something about how that is done.
That would be some good knowledge to have. I mean, it kind of gets to your ideas on the fourth frontier, and avoiding killing each other, which was always a good goal to have, I think. So one thing I'd asked you about, I think we were just having a conversation, not on the podcast, and I asked you first if this was a dumb question, and you assured me that it was not. So I'll ask it again and potentially embarrass myself. But the question goes something like this: being an evolutionary biologist, and how does that really compete with a more creationist view of humanity? Can these two theories be reconciled in any way? And does intelligent design play a role?
Well, they can be reconciled, but they are reconciled in a way that one side, actually, frankly, for some interesting reason, neither side likes very much. But basically, I would argue that it is quite clear that a religious viewpoint on questions like where did we come from and what is the meaning of life, that is it is an evolved parameter. In other words, we are favored to have a mystical view that creates an importance around our existence that is not actually in any meaningful sense God-given. That said, there are different versions of creationism. And, I think the problems stem from an insistence on the young Earth story, or maybe even a particular version of the young Earth story, which is just simply incompatible with everything we know about even the basic geology of the rock that we live on. So that one is going to continue to cause conflict every time it runs up against science. But I must say that my experience when I have talked to people involved in intelligent design has surprised me sometimes, because many of the people involved in intelligent design are actually deeply interested in taking a scientific perspective and exploring the Darwinian story that is still emerging. And while I think they are incorrect about ultimately why the story we are telling does not fully add up, they are not necessarily wrong about the places in which the story is incomplete. And so I find a weird alignment in the sense that my job as a theoretical evolutionary biologist is to figure out where we don't have the complete story and to try to fill in those details. And they are on a parallel mission. And, in those cases where I have interacted with folks from the Discovery Institute, for example, I've been very clear with them that I believe some of their critiques are hollow. Some of their critiques are excellent and worthy of consideration, but that ultimately the solution to the puzzle that they point to is more and better Darwinism. And they are very clear with me that they don't see it that way, but it does not prevent camaraderie or a shared wonder at the biota. I was expecting when I met these folks to discover that they were, in some sense, phony in their interest in biology, and I found exactly the opposite.
Oh, interesting. Well, give us some background real quick. The Discovery Institute, what's their main premise for those of us who don't know them?
The Discovery Institute is essentially a think tank that is involved in looking at various Darwinian questions and studying their possible resolution. And so, they have an interest in, for example, the fossil record for whales. Now, this is a place where it used to be that we didn't have very many intermediate fossils for whales, and so the Darwinians were forced to just simply guess at what the intermediate creatures might have looked like. That changed quite a bit. We discovered quite a number of whales with limbs in an intermediate state, for example. And so now we have a much better sense of how whales evolved from hippo-like creatures. On the other hand, it's not a complete record, and so there are questions about whether or not the evolutionary story that we traditionally teach can completely cover the gaps in that record or not. And I would say it does, but you can imagine that people who thought that there was something about the Darwinian story that was incomplete would be interested in the details of the evolution of these creatures, and they would be hunting for places where there was too big a gap to be explained in the period of time that we know the change must have occurred.
So, I mean, again, from a layman's perspective, not having a background in this, the question that troubles me, or I guess the observation, is that it's easy for me to comprehend how complex organisms over millions and millions of years evolve into a different kind of complex organism, maybe from hippo-like creatures to whales, as you mentioned. It's a bit harder to see how a single-cell organism could evolve into these complex organisms that look like us, with a consciousness and all of this. And I think this is where it seems mathematically impossible, or at least highly improbable, that a series of accidents and adaptations could lead to such complexity. And so, hence the notion of intelligent design. Again, I think what I said to you before was, for me, science describes things very well, but it's never the unmoved mover of philosophy, right? It's never the final explanation of the why. Why is something happening this way? And so, of course, like I am a believer in God as a higher power, but I'm also not somebody who's going to simply dismiss science that's right in front of me. And trying to reconcile those two things, I think it's a super interesting discussion.
Well, I would agree. I would say at some level, we have very little to say about ultimate cause, which doesn't mean that there is something supernatural involved there. In fact, I doubt that there is. But if you look far enough back, there simply is no way to explain, for example, where the universe came from within the universe. So that will likely remain open permanently. As for the details, for example, of how single-celled organisms become complex and then sentient life, that is actually a tractable problem. And it is one of the places that I actually find some alignment with the better of the folks who study intelligent design, for example, because one of the things that they have focused on is a question about how much time would be necessary for the changes that we see to evolve. But that assumes that the mechanisms of Darwinism that we are aware of and certain of are the sum total of them. And so I believe that logically there must be another layer that we have not yet figured out. So in essence, you can imagine even the story that you described, the one-sentence summary of how it works, that these random changes would be accumulated. That must initially have been the way Darwinian evolution took place. But over time, the creature that effectively searches the landscape of possibilities in some systematic way will outcompete over evolutionary time the creature that searches the landscape of possibilities in a random way. So, in effect, just in the same way that you do not randomly move through the world in order to accomplish whatever it is that you do, we should not expect evolution to remain a random pattern of bouncing around design space for very long, because one of the things that will be invented by that process is a mechanism for searching or spending more search time in places that are likely to be fruitful and less time in places that are likely to be dead ends. So I would argue that there has to be a category of evolutionary processes that I call explorer modes. And these explorer modes accelerate the rate of Darwinian evolution. And so, in my opinion, this answers one of the major challenges that the intelligent design community has focused on, which is how much time it would take some of the claimed adaptations to arise. They arise faster because the process that searches for them is better at not wasting time in cul-de-sacs.
Right. But I suppose the next question would be, okay, where does explorer mode come from then? You know, is self an evolutionary adaptation, or is that something else?
You nailed it. It is itself an adaptation. And so,
but why?
If you,
and it's like it gets to this existential question of like, what's the point of it all? And I guess I don't know that it's answerable.
Well, unfortunately, I think it is, and the answer just isn't very satisfying. The answer is that what the Darwinian process produces as an objective is that a creature gets itself as deeply into the future as it can. So persistence is really the objective of the Darwinian exercise. And that's not a very interesting objective. And in fact, I would argue that for humans, we have an obligation to alter our program, or basically to reject the evolutionary drive, because some of the ways that you would get yourself into the future aren't honorable.
So what do you think is the next? What would you think is the next adaptation? It's maybe a major one that the human race would see coming.
Well, I mean, I think there's actually only one more at some level. We are living, for both better and worse, the outgrowth of the last major evolutionary revolution, which was consciousness. That consciousness allows us to basically choose evolutionary puzzles to solve and to do so, which is why human beings exist as the dominant species in every habitat in which plants can grow. We're very good at figuring out how to solve evolutionary puzzles. Now, the final one is this fourth frontier puzzle, which is, can we figure out how to do that in a way that we don't destroy ourselves? And I think the answer is likely to be yes, but I don't know if we will accomplish it.
Do you think the story of Adam and Eve is one of the discovery of consciousness?
It's funny. It's a very insightful question, because at some level, the story of Adam and Eve is clearly not the story of the first people. I mean, it is just a story, but even as it's presented, it is clearly, in some sense, describing people born who are the first of some lineage. And so, the story of the tree of knowledge, I suppose, is a story about self-awareness and the costs that come with it. So, yeah, you could make that argument, and I don't think it's a bad one. I think there's something to it.
What about stem cells? What are you optimistic about the use of stem cells?
Somewhat, but not as much as others, for a very clear reason. I think we have focused on a question about how to reset certain tissues, and we have ignored the fact that there is the same reason that you can't regenerate an arm if it gets cut off. You can do a certain amount by basically generating a new arm, right? That's a technology we might be able to produce. But what we're losing track of is that the proper organization of the tissues of the body is the result of an unfolding process in which you go from one cell to something like 30 trillion cells in a pattern that is not perfectly regimented. In other words, it is not that your 30 trillion cell adult self is described anywhere. What is described in your genome is a series of feedbacks that result in a coherent 30 trillion cell organism arising. And so the reason we can't regenerate a limb is that you can't just go back and say, okay, do that part over, because the feedbacks are contingent on being at a particular place in development in order for the information that's fed into the system to be correct. So there are things stem cells can clearly do. The ability to correct for a diseased process is promising. The hope that you can effectively reverse aging, for example, as some people imagine, it's very unlikely to be accurate. And frankly, I think we'd be better off in many ways to recognize that that's an intractable problem and to get over it.
Yeah, it might make us feel better. So what about like the CRISPR project? You know, the notion of gene editing and genetic engineering. How do you generally feel about that?
Well, I think there is a major danger there, but there are dangers in the present from this technology. There's also, in some sense, just as you described, politicians who tell us an overly rosy picture in order to get elected. I think the scientific establishment has told us something about CRISPR that isn't true yet. It's led us to believe that the ability to basically type out any genetic sequence we want and bring it into the world is, it's like the power of gods. But the fact is, we have the typewriter, but we don't have the Rosetta Stone. And until you have the Rosetta Stone, it's not like, if you had all the characters in the Mayan language, that's the equivalent of speaking Mayan. It's just not remotely close. So, yes, we've got the tool, but we don't know how to use it yet. And so our power is limited until we figure out what the language of the genome it really is. Yeah.
Okay. You can see that going off a pretty crazy direction if you get the language wrong. So one thing you've worked on, and you talked about this on Joe Rogan's podcast. I don't have my notes in front of me on this one, but telomeres, right? And how that is, you've done some research on this. Did I get that word right?
Yep. Telomeres.
Okay. Telomeres. Yeah. And your research on cancer. So what is the breakthrough there? What could we maybe look forward to?
Well, so this is work from a long time ago when I was a graduate student. And, it's not like I had a cancer lab or something like that. What I did was I put things together that were emerging in different quadrants. And so there were people studying telomeric processes in cancer biology. There were people studying these processes with respect to aging. And then there was a framework in evolutionary biology for understanding human aging. And I synthesized these things and came up with a startling picture that explained, in a sense that we hadn't done it before, why we grow feeble and inefficient with age, effectively why we have to die. And it has to do with the fact that your body, the 30 trillion cells that make you up at any moment of your adult life, they are almost all wired to self-replace. And that process of self-repair through the generation of new cells creates a cancer risk in almost every tissue of your body that can kill you at almost any moment. So selection has built a fail-safe into this system. And that fail-safe involves these sequences called telomeres at the ends of your chromosomes. These are repetitive sequences. They're not genes. They don't code for proteins. But what happens is every time a cell divides, a little bit of the telomeric sequence is lost. And there comes a point when the telomere has grown so short that the cell refuses to divide, and it will actually go through some interesting changes. And the reason that this is there, what I figured out, was that it was a fail-safe against cells that had become deaf to the signals that they were supposed to stop growing and therefore became tumors. So if you set a limit on how many times a cell can reproduce, then if you get a mutation that causes a cell to forget that it's supposed to stop growing, it runs into that limit and you get effectively a mole. In fact, we know that moles are exactly this. They are sets of cells that ran away and would have become a tumor if they weren't arrested at what's called the Hayflick limit. So that protection against cancer is what allows you to live into adulthood without being overrun by tumors. But it comes with a cost, and the cost is that you don't have the ability to regenerate all your tissues and remain young forever, that each tissue begins to fail at the first age at which members of your species typically reproduce, and continues to fail at an accelerating rate until you ultimately die from organ failure in one place or another, or cancer or something else kills you. So the good news is that this buys us an incredibly long life. We are, aside from a particular population of whales, we are the longest lived mammals in existence, and by quite a good margin. So selection has lengthened our lives by balancing the risk of cancer against the risk of death by aging. But it can't balance it to the point that you live indefinitely. Ultimately, you will succumb to one or the other hazard.
So our lifespan keeps getting longer. What do you think the upper limit to that is?
Well, it doesn't keep getting longer. Our average lives keep getting longer.
Sure.
The maximum, the thing that's really unsettling is that the maximum is somewhere just a little north of 120 years. And we know that because we've surveyed population after population, and it is a very rare individual that makes it to 120, but nobody makes it to 130. So that is something that might be barely alterable through Herculean effort in the laboratory. We might discover a mechanism to buy you a few more years. They might not be good years. In fact, they almost certainly wouldn't. But it's possible that if we invested in the project, we could adjust maximum lifespan a little. But the problem is that, if we go back to trade-offs, as we discussed at the beginning, that the process of figuring out how to increase maximum human longevity comes at the cost of everything else you might do with those resources, including figuring out how to increase average longevity, which is something we already know how to do, and we have spectacular successes under our belt already. So increasing both average longevity and quality of life are goals that we can make progress on if we're simply willing to invest in it, and the pursuit of increasing maximum longevity is essentially a totally pointless exercise. I mean, even if you figured out how to... Oh, go ahead.
No, so it's interesting because we do have sort of the cultural obsession with immortality. Vampires and movies made about it. Wolverine is basically immortal, although even he started to fade at one point, as per the recent movie. But what's interesting is even you never see a happy immortal. Even in our pop culture, no. You notice that? It's so interesting. And I guess because I think we intuitively understand that it eventually just becomes devastating to the psyche.
Oh, I think it would be absolutely. I mean, one thing, it would be, if you made the body young forever, you still haven't figured out what to do about the mind. The mind is clearly built for a lifespan of more like 80 years. And it's a whole separate puzzle. How much would you have to forget in order to allow your mind to continue to remember the important things for a lifespan of, let's say, 500 years? We don't have the first clue how to address that puzzle. So there's one way in which it's even preposterous to think in these terms. But even if you did, let's say you figured out how to live 500 or 1,000 years, it would rob life of its meaning. The thing that makes life work is that it is precious and fleeting, and that is itself a driver of much that is good. What's more, people do not realize that selection has already solved this problem in a very elegant way, and that it is a narcissism of the moment that causes us to ignore the solution and try to work around it. The solution is that you will die, but you'll produce offspring, and you will teach them the best stuff you know, and they will acquire some stuff that you didn't know, and they will add it to their program, and they will produce offspring. That's the solution, is to take the important, the precious part of a human being, which is what they come to understand, their values, what it is that they contribute. That part gets offloaded from one person into those who knew them, including most especially their offspring. And in that way, we're not immortal, but we last a great deal longer if we endeavor to know things that are closer to timeless and to pass them on. So really, in terms of an investment, that's the place to invest.
I think that's a deep statement and fundamentally true as well. That's really interesting. That hour went by pretty fast. I think we're already at the limits here. Fascinating discussion with you, Bret. Thank you so much for being on again.
I appreciate it, and thanks for all you do. It was a very good discussion, and I enjoyed our last one as well.
Yeah, and thanks for being on, and I'll have you on again soon, I'm sure.